My name is Bridget Williams, and at 67 years old, I never expected to be a widow with $53 million in my bank account. My only son, Jackson, recently married a woman named Amelia after dating for just 6 months. Something in my gut told me to keep quiet about the fortune my late husband Harold left me. Thank goodness I listened to that instinct, because 5 days after their wedding, Amelia showed up at my doorstep with a lawyer in tow. Before I tell you what happened when Amelia showed up with a lawyer at my door, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to hear how I protected what took my husband 40 years to build. Harold and I were married for 42 beautiful years, before cancer took him from me 18 months ago. Most people in our town knew him as the friendly owner of Williams Hardware, but few knew the empire he had quietly built over 4 decades. Harold started with absolutely nothing. The son of a factory worker in Michigan, he dropped out of college when his father got sick and took a job at a local hardware store to help support his family. He was only 22 at the time, with nothing but determination and a strong work ethic. We met when I came in looking for supplies to fix my apartment sink. I was 25 and working as a kindergarten teacher at the time. "You know, most women your age would just call a plumber," he said with that crooked smile I grew to love so much. "Most women my age don't have student loans and a broken-down car to pay for," I replied. He not only sold me the right parts but insisted on showing me how to fix the sink myself. We were married 8 months later, and soon after, Harold scraped together enough for a down payment on a tiny, struggling hardware store on the edge of town. "This will be the first of many," he told me the day we got the keys. I believed him, but I had no idea just how right he would be. Over the next 20 years, Harold expanded to 5 locations across the state. By the time he was 50, Williams Hardware had grown to 23 stores across the Midwest. Through it all, we lived modestly in the same 4-bedroom house we bought when Jackson was born. We drove sensible cars, took 1 vacation a year, and reinvested most of the profits back into the business. "Money should work for you, not the other way around," Harold always said. "Flash your cash, and you attract the wrong kind of people." Those words would come back to me many times after he was gone. When Jackson was born, Harold started setting aside money for his future. Our son grew up understanding the value of hard work, but never knowing the true extent of our wealth. Harold wanted him to find his own path without the burden or privilege that comes with significant family money. Jackson chose academia instead of business. He studied literature and eventually earned his PhD, becoming a professor at Westlake University. Harold couldn't have been prouder, even though our son had no interest in taking over the family business. "He's doing what he loves," Harold told me. "That's worth more than any amount of money I could leave him." 3 years before his diagnosis, Harold received an offer from a national chain to buy Williams Hardware. After much consideration, he accepted their $50 million offer. He invested most of it wisely, growing our nest egg even further. When Harold was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. He fought bravely for 14 months before passing away peacefully in our home with Jackson and me by his side. His last coherent words to me were, "Take care of our boy, but make sure he stands on his own 2 feet." After the funeral, I learned the full extent of what Harold had left me. Between the business sale investments, life insurance, and our properties, I inherited $53 million. Jackson received a trust fund of $1 million that would mature when he turned 35, still 3 years away. Harold had structured everything meticulously with his attorney, making sure I would be the sole decision-maker regarding the bulk of the estate. The grief was overwhelming in those first months. I wandered around our house, touching Harold's things, sleeping in his bathrobe, and watching old home videos until my eyes burned. Jackson was my rock during that time, coming over several times a week, calling daily and making sure I was eating properly. For the first year, I barely thought about the money. It sat in accounts managed by Thomas, Harold's financial advisor, while I learned how to be a person without my husband. Eventually, I started seeing friends again, and even joined a widow's support group at the community center. Through it all, Jackson remained single. He had a few relationships over the years, but nothing serious. At 32, he seemed content with his books, his students, and his close circle of friends. I sometimes worried he might end up alone, but I kept those thoughts to myself. After all, Harold and I had raised him to make his own choices. Then, 6 months ago, everything changed when Jackson met Amelia at a university fundraising gala. She was 29, strikingly beautiful, and worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. The way Jackson described their meeting, it sounded like something from a romance novel. She was standing alone by the fountain in the courtyard. "Mom," he told me, his eyes practically sparkling. She was wearing this blue dress, and when she turned around, I swear time stopped. Within 2 weeks, they were dating exclusively. Jackson brought her to Sunday dinner at my house a month after they met. I still remember the sound of her high heels clicking on my hardwood floors as she walked in, designer handbag on her arm and diamonds glittering at her ears and throat. "Your home is so charming," Amelia said, looking around my living room with what I now recognize was calculation rather than appreciation. "Jackson mentioned your husband ran some hardware stores. Was it a small local chain?" There was something about the way she asked that made me pause. It seemed too direct, too interested in the business rather than the man who built it. But I brushed it off, attributing my wariness to being overprotective of both Jackson and Harold's memory. "Harold built it from the ground up," I replied simply. "It was his life's work." "And he sold it before he passed, right?" she pressed. "That must have been a nice retirement package for you both." Jackson quickly changed the subject, but that moment stuck with me. It was the first of many red flags I would notice about Amelia, though I tried to ignore them for Jackson's sake. After dinner that night, as I washed dishes and Jackson helped dry them like we always did, Amelia excused herself to use the bathroom. She was gone for nearly 20 minutes. Later, I found my bedroom door slightly ajar, though I always keep it closed. Nothing seemed disturbed, but it felt like someone had been looking through my things. When Harold was alive, he often told me, "Trust your gut, Bridge. It knows things before your head catches up." That night, my gut was sending me warning signals about Amelia. But Jackson seemed happier than I'd seen him in years, so I kept my concerns to myself and remembered another piece of Harold's wisdom: keep your cards close until you know who you're playing with. Jackson and Amelia's relationship progressed at a speed that left me breathless. Within 2 months of their first date, Amelia had moved into Jackson's modest 2-bedroom apartment near the university campus. This was the same son who had once told me he valued his space and independence too much to rush into cohabitation. "Isn't this moving a bit fast, sweetheart?" I asked during one of our weekly coffee dates at the small cafe near his university. "When you know," Jackson replied with a carefree shrug that was completely out of character for my thoughtful, methodical son. "Dad always said he proposed to you after knowing you for only 6 months. "That was different," I said carefully. "We were younger and times were different." Jackson just smiled and changed the subject to the European Literature Conference he would be attending the following month. It was only later that I realized Amelia would be accompanying him on this trip, which was unusual since academic conferences weren't exactly romantic getaways. The changes in Jackson weren't limited to his relationship timeline. His spending habits shifted dramatically in ways that concerned me. My son had always been frugal, saving diligently from his professor's salary and driving the same reliable Honda for the past 8 years. Suddenly, he was wearing designer clothes, had upgraded to a luxury watch, and was talking about trading in his car for something more suitable for a man in his position. When I asked about these changes, Jackson waved away my concerns. "I deserve to enjoy life a little, Mom. Amelia helped me realize I've been too conservative with my money." During a dinner at an expensive restaurant that Jackson insisted on paying for, I noticed Amelia continuously steering the conversation toward family finances. What started as casual questions became increasingly focused. "Jackson mentioned your husband was quite the businessman," Amelia said, swirling her third glass of $100 wine. "He must have left you well taken care of." "Harold was prudent with money," I answered noncommittally. "He made sure I wouldn't have to worry." But the hardware chain she pressed. "Jackson said it was quite extensive before the sale. That must have brought in millions, right?" Jackson looked uncomfortable but didn't interrupt as Amelia continued her probing. "And I imagine there were significant investments as well. Most successful businessmen diversify their portfolios." "Harold handled all of that," I said, deliberately vague. I've never been much for financial details. This was, of course, untrue. Harold had made sure I understood every aspect of our finances, insisting that I be able to manage everything if something happened to him. But something told me to keep that information to myself. After that dinner, I began noticing a pattern. Jackson was calling less frequently. Our Sunday dinners became monthly, then sporadic. When we did speak, Amelia was often present, monitoring our conversations with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. 3 months into their relationship, Jackson canceled our long-standing plans to visit Harold's grave on his birthday, something we had promised each other we would always do together. When I called him that evening, hurt and confused, Amelia answered his phone. "Jackson's in the shower," she said. "He feels terrible about today, but we had this charity gala for my company that couldn't be missed. Career networking, you understand. I'm sure Harold would want Jackson to succeed." The casual use of my late husband's name from someone who had never met him felt like a slap. When Jackson finally called back the next day, his apology seemed rehearsed and hollow. Worried and increasingly isolated from my son, I called my best friend Doris for lunch. We had been friends for over 40 years, and she was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation. "Something's not right with this girl," I confided as we sat in her sunny kitchen. "She's constantly asking about money, about Harold's business, about what he left behind." Doris reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "And what have you told her?" "Nothing specific," I assured her. "Harold always said to be careful who you share financial information with." "Smart man," Doris nodded. "And you should listen to him now. Don't tell her anything until you're absolutely sure of her intentions." "But what if I'm wrong?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. "What if she truly loves Jackson and I'm just being a suspicious old woman?" "Then no harm done," Doris said firmly. "If she loves him for him, your money shouldn't matter. But if she's after what Harold built, you'll be glad you kept quiet." That conversation strengthened my resolve to protect not just my assets but Jackson as well, even if he didn't realize he needed protection. My caution proved prescient when, just 4 months after they met, Jackson called with news that knocked the wind out of me. "We're engaged, Mom," he announced, his voice a mixture of excitement and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I asked Amelia last night, and she said yes." I gripped the phone tightly, forcing enthusiasm into my voice while my mind raced with concerns. "That's wonderful news, sweetheart. Have you set a date?" "Actually, yes. We're thinking next month. Small ceremony, close friends and family." Next month, I couldn't keep the shock from my voice. "That's very soon, Jackson." "When you find the right person, why wait?" he said, echoing his earlier sentiment in a way that sounded rehearsed. "Amelia's always dreamed of a spring wedding, and we don't want anything elaborate." That last part at least was a relief, until he continued. "Actually, Mom, I was hoping to talk to you about possibly helping us with some of the expenses. Professor's salary doesn't stretch as far as it used to, and Amelia has her heart set on a few special touches." It was the first time in his adult life that Jackson had asked me for financial help beyond the occasional birthday or Christmas gift. Harold and I had raised him to be independent, and he had always taken pride in making his own way. "Of course," I said carefully, "I'd be happy to contribute. Why don't you come over this weekend and we can discuss the details?" After hanging up, I sat in Harold's old study, staring at his photograph on the desk. "What would you do, my love?" I whispered to his smiling image. I could almost hear his response. "Protect our boy Bridge. But remember, he has to make his own mistakes." The question was whether this particular mistake might cost him more than just a broken heart. What Jackson had described as a few special touches for the wedding turned out to be an extravagant affair that seemed to grow more elaborate with each passing day. The small ceremony transformed into a 150-guest event at the Grand Lakeside Hotel, the most expensive venue in our city. When Jackson and Amelia came to discuss wedding plans, I was shocked by the list of expenses Amelia presented. Designer, wedding dress, custom-tailored tuxedo, top-shelf open bar, 5-course gourmet dinner, live band, exotic flower arrangements flown in from South America, and a photographer who normally shot for celebrity magazines. The total comes to just under $70,000. Amelia announced, sliding a spreadsheet across my kitchen table with the casualness of someone ordering coffee. Jackson looked uncomfortable but remained silent. I noticed he was wearing a new watch that must have cost at least $5,000 and wondered how deep into debt he was already. "That's quite a sum for a small wedding," I said carefully. Amelia gave a practiced laugh. "Well, we only plan to do this once. And really, this is quite reasonable compared to what many couples spend these days." I looked at Jackson, trying to gauge if this was truly what he wanted. He avoided my eyes, staring instead at the spreadsheet. "I can contribute $20,000 toward the wedding," I offered deliberately, choosing an amount that was generous but nowhere near the total they were asking for. It was also a fraction of what I could easily afford, but I wanted to see how they would react. Amelia's smile faltered slightly. "That's very generous, but we were hoping you might consider covering the full amount. After all, traditionally, the bride's family pays, but Amelia's parents are in a difficult financial situation right now." "Dad left you comfortable, right, Mom?" Jackson added, finally looking up. "I know he would want us to have a nice wedding." The mention of Harold caught me off guard. My husband had always emphasized living within one's means and finding value in experiences rather than extravagance. The wedding they were describing would have made him cringe. "Your father believed in financial responsibility," I said gently. "20,000 is my contribution. You two will need to adjust your plans or find another way to cover the difference." After they left with Amelia barely concealing her disappointment, I received a text from Jackson. "Amelia's upset. She says most mothers would be more generous, especially widows who were left well off. Can we talk about increasing your contribution?" That text confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Amelia believed I had significant wealth and was pushing Jackson to access it. The question was how much she thought I had and how far she would go to get it. 2 weeks later, Jackson called to say they had scaled back some plans and secured a loan for the remaining costs. He sounded stressed but insisted everything was fine. I transferred the $20,000 to his account the next day, feeling both relieved and concerned about this new debt they were taking on. As the wedding date approached, I found myself increasingly sidelined in the planning process. Amelia had taken control, communicating with me only when financial matters needed discussion. She arranged a mother of the groom dress for me without consultation, sending me a navy blue ensemble that was 2 sizes too large and stylistically about 20 years too old for me. "Amelia thought this would be perfect for you," the boutique owner said when I went in for alterations. "She mentioned you prefer conservative styles." I exchanged it for something more appropriate, a decision that led to a tense phone call from Amelia about respecting her vision for the wedding aesthetic. The day before the final venue walkthrough, I arrived early and overheard Amelia on her phone in the hotel lobby, speaking in a hushed but excited tone. "Everything's going according to plan," she was saying. "The wedding's on track, and after that it's just a matter of time before we get access to the family money. Jackson has no idea how much there really is, but his mother must be sitting on a fortune from that business sale." My blood ran cold as she continued. "Once we're married, I'll work on convincing him to ask for our fair share. She can't take it with her, and why should we wait for an inheritance when they could be helping us now?" I slipped away before she could see me, my mind racing. This confirmation of my worst fears sent me straight to Thomas, my financial advisor, the following morning. "I need to protect my assets," I told him bluntly after explaining the situation. "My son is marrying a woman who seems to be after my money, and I'm worried about what might happen after they're married." Thomas nodded gravely. "Unfortunately, this is not uncommon in situations where there's significant wealth involved. Have you been transparent with Jackson about the extent of your assets?" "No," I admitted. "Harold and I always believed Jackson should make his own way. He knows we were comfortable, but not the full extent." "That was probably wise," Thomas said. "Now we need to ensure everything is properly structured to protect both you and ultimately Jackson himself." He recommended I meet with Linda, my attorney, to review and update my estate planning. "Make sure your will, trusts, and other legal documents are current and reflect your wishes. Consider setting up specific conditions for any inheritance Jackson might receive." The meeting with Linda was both reassuring and sobering. We spent 3 hours reviewing my entire estate plan, making adjustments to protect my assets from potential claims. In most states, a new spouse would have no legal claim to your assets, Linda explained. But if Jackson were to inherit and then commingle those assets with marital property, things could get complicated in the event of a divorce. We set up a series of trusts with specific conditions that would protect Jackson's eventual inheritance even in case of a divorce. Linda also helped me draft a letter explaining my decisions to be given to Jackson if anything happened to me. As I left her office, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I was protecting what Harold and I had built, but at the cost of complete openness with my only child. I was keeping secrets from Jackson at a time when we should have been celebrating his happiness. Am I doing the right thing? I asked myself as I drove home. The memory of Amelia's phone conversation answered my question. This wasn't just about protecting money, it was about protecting Jackson from someone who saw him as a path to wealth rather than a partner to love. That evening, Jackson called to ask if I could increase my contribution to cover unexpected wedding costs. The conversation was awkward, with Jackson clearly uncomfortable making the request. Amelia found out the flowers will cost more than expected, he explained. And the photographer wants an additional deposit for the extra hours. I've already transferred the amount we agreed on, I said firmly. That's my contribution, Jackson. But Mom, he pressed, it's not like you can't afford it. Dad left you well off, and this is your only son's wedding. My financial situation is not the issue, I replied. It's about boundaries and living within your means values your father and I tried to instill in you. There was a pause before Jackson spoke again, his voice suddenly sounding more like the son I knew. You're right. I'm sorry, Mom. We'll figure it out. After we hung up, I sat in Harold's favorite chair, trying to reconcile the principled, thoughtful son we raised with the man who was now pushing for money to fund an extravagant wedding to a woman who clearly had ulterior motives. I miss you, Harold, I whispered into the empty room. You would know exactly what to do right now. As if in answer, I remembered something Harold often said when faced with difficult business decisions. When in doubt, wait it out. Time reveals truth better than any investigation. With the wedding just 2 weeks away, I decided to follow that advice. I would attend the wedding, support my son, and keep my financial situation private, while watching carefully for what time would reveal about Amelia's true intentions. The morning of Jackson and Amelia's wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day that seemed to mock my inner turmoil. As I dressed in my altered navy blue dress, applying makeup to hide the signs of another restless night, I tried to focus on one simple fact. This was my son's wedding day, and regardless of my concerns about his bride, I needed to be present and supportive. The Grand Lakeside Hotel had been transformed into something from a luxury magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures over the outdoor ceremony space. White orchids and roses adorned every surface, their perfume heavy in the air. A string quartet played softly as guests arrived, many looking somewhat bewildered by the opulence. Quite the production, isn't it? Said Martin, Harold's former business partner and Jackson's godfather, as he joined me near the entrance. Harold would have thought it was all a bit much. I smiled sadly. He would have suggested they take the money and put it toward a house down payment instead. Martin nodded, his eyes scanning the elaborate setup. Speaking of money, any idea how they're affording all this? Last I knew, professors weren't making this kind of salary, and you mentioned you contributed just a portion. That's been concerning me too, I admitted quietly. I believe they took out loans. Amelia seems to have expensive tastes. Well, Martin said, patting my hand, Jackson has a good head on his shoulders. Harold made sure of that. He'll figure things out. I wished I shared his confidence. The ceremony itself was beautiful if overproduced. Jackson looked handsome in his tuxedo, though I noticed a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he recited his vows, his voice was steady, but lacked the emotion I would have expected on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Amelia, resplendent in a designer gown that must have cost thousands, seemed more focused on the photographer capturing her good side than on the words she was speaking. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, her triumphant smile sent a chill down my spine. At the reception, I was seated at the family table, alongside Amelia's parents, whom I was meeting for the first time. Frank and Judith Sullivan were visibly uncomfortable in the lavish surroundings, their department store clothes, standing out among the designer outfits of the wedding party. "This is all so fancy," Judith whispered to me after introducing herself. We told Amelia we couldn't contribute much, but she insisted everything had to be perfect. "It's certainly elaborate." I agreed, watching as waiters circulated with trays of champagne that I knew cost over $100 per bottle. "Were you surprised by how quickly they decided to get married?" Frank shifted in his seat. "Between us, yes. Amelia has always been well ambitious. When she told us about Jackson and his family background, we were concerned she might be rushing things for the wrong reasons." "His family background?" I asked carefully. Judith looked around before leaning closer. She mentioned his father owned a successful business. She seemed quite focused on that aspect when describing him to us. Before I could respond, the DJ announced the couple's entrance, and the conversation was cut short by applause. Throughout dinner, I observed Amelia's parents, noting their discomfort with the extravagance and the way they seemed surprised by certain references to their daughter's life and career. During the toasts, Amelia clinked her glass and stood her smile dazzling under the chandeliers. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate our special day," she began. "Especially my new mother-in-law, Bridget, who raised such a wonderful man and welcomed me into a family with such security and prosperity." Her emphasis on those last words was subtle but unmistakable. I noticed Jackson shift slightly in his seat, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. After the meal, as guests began to dance, I made my way to the restroom. In the hallway outside, I overheard Amelia speaking to a woman I recognized as her maid of honor. "Stop worrying about the cost," Amelia was saying. "This is just the beginning. We'll be set for life soon enough." "But these credit cards are in your name," her friend replied. "And you've maxed out 3 of them for this wedding." Amelia laughed. "Trust me, it's an investment. Jackson's mom is loaded, she just plays it down. His dad sold his business for millions before he died." I slipped into the restroom before they could see me, my hands shaking as I gripped the sink. The confirmation of Amelia's intentions brought no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for my son and anger at being right about her motives. Later, during a rare moment when Jackson was alone near the bar, I approached him. The 4 drinks he'd had seemed to have loosened something in him, and for a moment my genuine son shone through the facade he'd been maintaining. "Mom," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I need to tell you something. About Amelia, about all of this." But before he could continue, Amelia appeared at his side, her arm sliding possessively through his. "There you are, darling. The photographer wants some sunset shots by the lake." The moment was gone. Jackson gave me an apologetic look as Amelia led him away, his unspoken words hanging between us. As the reception wound down, I noticed a distinct cooling in Amelia's demeanor toward me. The saccharine mother-in-law act she had maintained dropped away when most guests had left, replaced by brief, almost dismissive interactions. When I approached to say goodbye, she barely looked at me, focused instead on instructing the wedding planner about preserving the top tier of the wedding cake. "Jackson, I'm heading home," I said, embracing my son. "It was a beautiful wedding." "Thanks for everything, Mom," he replied, hugging me tightly. There was something desperate in his embrace, something that made me want to take him home with me, like when he was a little boy with a scraped knee. Amelia finally turned to me, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Yes, thank you for your contribution. We managed to make it work despite the limited budget." The barb was intentional, and I saw Jackson wince. Rather than respond, I simply smiled and kissed my son's cheek. "Call me when you get back from your honeymoon." That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every interaction, every overheard conversation, every uncomfortable moment from the wedding. The extravagance, the loans, Amelia's focus on family money, Jackson's almost confession at the bar, it all pointed to a situation that was likely to get worse before it got better. The next morning, my phone rang early. It was Jackson calling before they left for their honeymoon in Bali, another expense I knew they couldn't afford. "Mom." His voice sounded strained. "I just wanted to check in before we leave." "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked. There was a pause. Yeah, everything's fine. Amelia and I were talking and we're thinking about looking at houses when we get back. Nothing too fancy, but something with a little more space than my apartment. I waited, sensing there was more. I was wondering if you might consider helping us with a down payment. You know, as a wedding gift. Amelia mentioned that many parents do that for their children these days. The request confirmed my fears that this was only the beginning of financial demands. Jackson, buying a house is a big decision. Why don't we talk about it when you get back? Enjoy your honeymoon and don't worry about house hunting just yet. Sure, he said, sounding relieved yet disappointed. That makes sense. As we said goodbye, I couldn't shake the feeling that my son was in deeper than he realized, caught in a web of expectations and financial commitments that were already spiraling beyond his control. Oh, Harold, I whispered after hanging up. Our boy is in trouble and I don't know if he even sees it yet. 5 days after the wedding, I was in my garden tending to the rose bushes Harold and I had planted together on our 10th anniversary. The spring sunshine was warm on my back as I carefully pruned dead branches, finding solace in the familiar routine. Jackson and Amelia were still on their honeymoon in Bali, sending occasional photos of tropical beaches and luxury resort amenities that made me wince thinking about the credit card bills to come. The sound of tires on my gravel driveway pulled me from my thoughts. Looking up, I saw a sleek black Mercedes I didn't recognize parking beside my modest Volvo. The knot in my stomach tightened when Amelia stepped out of the passenger side, dressed in designer sunglasses and a crisp white pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. What shocked me more was seeing a middle-aged man in an expensive suit emerging from the driver's side. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of practiced neutrality that I recognized from my meetings with Harold's lawyers over the years. Jackson was nowhere to be seen. I removed my gardening gloves and walked toward them, a sense of foreboding growing with each step. Amelia, I said, keeping my voice even. This is a surprise. I thought you and Jackson were in Bali until next week. We were supposed to be, she replied, without offering further explanation. Bridget, this is Albert Wright, our family financial advisor. We need to talk to you about something important. Our family financial advisor. They had been married less than a week, and suddenly they had a family financial advisor I had never heard of. I see, I said calmly. Why don't we go inside? I can make some coffee. Once in my living room with untouched coffee cups on the table between us, Albert Wright opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Mrs. Williams, he began in a tone that managed to be both respectful and condescending. Amelia has consulted me about a matter of family finances that we believe needs addressing promptly. I looked at Amelia, whose expression had transformed from the charming daughter-in-law act she had maintained before the wedding to something harder and more calculating. Where is Jackson? I asked her directly. He's meeting with a realtor about a property we're interested in, she replied smoothly. He sends his regards, but thought this conversation might be easier without him present. That didn't sound like my son at all, and my suspicion deepened. Albert cleared his throat. Mrs. Williams, it has come to our attention that, following your husband's passing, you inherited approximately $53 million from the sale of his hardware store chain and other investments. The precise figure sent a chill through me. I had never shared that number with anyone outside my financial advisors and attorney. And how exactly did this come to your attention? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Amelia leaned forward. Jackson found some of his father's old business papers in storage. The sale figures were documented there. We were quite surprised to learn the extent of the family wealth, especially given your modest lifestyle. I doubted very much that Jackson had found any such papers, or that he would have shared them if he had. This had Amelia's fingerprints all over it, likely from her unauthorized explorations of my home before the wedding. I see, I said, revealing nothing. And why is this relevant to today's visit? Albert smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Williams, Amelia, and Jackson believe that as the only son and heir to the Williams family legacy, Jackson should have access to a portion of these funds now, rather than waiting for an inheritance that could be decades away. "We're not getting any younger," Amelia added with breathtaking audacity. "And frankly, it seems selfish to hoard such wealth when it could be helping your son and his wife establish themselves properly." I took a moment to study them both, keeping my expression neutral despite the anger building inside me. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Albert pushed a document toward me. "We've prepared a reasonable proposal for an initial distribution of assets. We believe $10 million would be appropriate to help the newlyweds purchase a suitable home, establish investment accounts, and clear any debts incurred during the wedding." $10 million. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. The sheer audacity of the demand was breathtaking. "Additionally," he continued, "we suggest a monthly stipend of $25,000 to support their lifestyle, while Jackson focuses on his academic career and Amelia potentially transitions to family life." Family life. The implication was clear, and it made my blood run cold. They were already dangling potential grandchildren as leverage. And if I decline this generous proposal, I asked, my voice cool. Amelia's facade cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing her features before she composed herself. "Then we would need to explore other options. Albert has mentioned the possibility that Harold's will might be contestable, especially if we could demonstrate that you influenced him unduly during his illness." Or Albert added, smoothly, "Concerns could be raised about your capacity to manage such significant assets at your age. Courts often look favorably on claims from children seeking to protect family wealth from potential mismanagement." They were threatening me. Threatening to declare me incompetent or accuse me of manipulating my dying husband, all to get their hands on Harold's life's work. I stood up slowly, my decision made. "I think this conversation has gone far enough. I'm going to have to ask you both to leave my home." "You're making a mistake," Amelia said, her pleasant mask completely gone now. "Jackson will be devastated to learn how little you care about his future." "I doubt that very much," I replied. "In fact, I wonder if Jackson knows you're here at all." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "Of course he does. This was his idea." The lie was so transparent it almost made me laugh. "Then I'll discuss it with him directly when he returns. Until then, I have nothing more to say to either of you." Albert gathered his papers, looking uncomfortable for the first time. Perhaps he was realizing he had misjudged the situation or the ease with which I could be intimidated. As they walked to the door, Amelia turned back, her expression now openly hostile. "This isn't over, Bridget. You can share what's rightfully part of our family now or lose your son forever. The choice is yours." After they left, I sat trembling in Harold's chair, anger and fear washing over me in waves. Not fear for myself or even for the money, but for Jackson. If Amelia was willing to go this far, after less than a week of marriage, what else might she do? I reached for my phone and called Linda, my attorney. Her secretary put me through immediately upon hearing the urgency in my voice. "Linda," I said, "without preamble, I need your help. My daughter-in-law just showed up with someone claiming to be a financial advisor, demanding $10 million and threatening legal action if I refuse." Linda's response was immediate and reassuring. "Don't worry, Bridget. They have no legal ground to stand on. Document everything that was said today while it's fresh in your mind. Email it to me and don't communicate with either of them again until we've developed a strategy." After hanging up, I did as Linda suggested, typing out every detail of the conversation while it was still fresh. Then I called Thomas, my financial advisor, to alert him to the situation and ensure no one could access any of my accounts without proper authorization. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with worry for Jackson and anger at Amelia's manipulation. I wondered where my son really was and if he had any idea what his new wife was doing in his name. The confrontation had made one thing crystal clear: my instincts about Amelia had been right all along. Now I needed to find a way to help Jackson see the truth before she did irreparable damage to his life and our relationship. The day after Amelia's ambush with her so-called financial advisor, I was still reeling from the confrontation. I had spent the morning on the phone with Linda discussing legal protections and next steps when the doorbell rang. My heart jumped to my throat, fearing Amelia had returned with more demands or threats. Instead, when I opened the door, I found Jackson standing alone on my porch looking haggard and nothing like a man on his honeymoon. His eyes were bloodshot with dark circles beneath them, his clothes rumpled as if he had slept in them. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Can I come in?" I pulled him into a hug before ushering him inside. Up close, he looked even worse, a shadow of the confident professor who had stood at the altar just days earlier. "Jackson, what happened? Why aren't you in Bali?" I led him to the kitchen, automatically putting on the kettle for tea like I had done throughout his childhood whenever he was upset. He slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "We came back early. Amelia said she had a work emergency, but..." He trailed off, looking lost. "But that wasn't true," I prompted, gently setting a mug of chamomile tea in front of him. Jackson looked up, his eyes haunted. "She told me she was meeting with a colleague yesterday afternoon. When she came back to our apartment, she was furious, saying you had been cruel and dismissive when she stopped by to check on you." So that was the story she had concocted. Jackson Amelia did come here yesterday, but not alone and not to check on me. I explained what had really happened, watching my son's expression shift from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a devastating realization. $10 million, he whispered. "She demanded $10 million from you." I nodded. "And monthly payments of $25,000. They claimed it was your idea, that you knew about the meeting." Jackson's face crumpled. "I had no idea, Mom. I swear to you." He pressed his palms against his eyes. "But I should have. God, I should have seen this coming." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He took a shaky breath. "Things have been strange since the wedding." On our first night in Bali, Amelia started talking about looking at multi-million-dollar properties when we got back. When I told her we couldn't afford anything like that, she laughed and said not to worry, that family money would take care of it. My heart ached for him as he continued. Then I found her going through my laptop, looking at files from Dad's old study that I had scanned years ago. When I asked what she was doing, she got defensive, saying she was just trying to learn more about the family business. Jackson's hands were shaking around his mug. The next morning, I woke up to find her on the phone with someone discussing asset transfers and family trusts. When she saw me, she hung up immediately. "Why didn't you say something, confront her?" I asked. "I did later that day." She denied everything, said I was being paranoid and ruining our honeymoon. But then I found notes she'd made about Dad's business with figures circled and calculations in the margins. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with shame. One note said, "Approximately $53 million inherited by mother-in-law." This was my moment to be completely honest with my son. "Jackson, that figure is accurate. Your father's business sale, investments, and life insurance left me with $53 million. His eyes widened. I knew Dad did well, but I had no idea it was that much. "We didn't want the money to define your life or your choices," I explained. "Your father believed strongly that you should find your own path, build your own success." "And I thought I had," Jackson said bitterly. "I was proud of my career, my independence. But Amelia..." He trailed off, looking down at his hands. "You fell in love," I said gently. "There's no shame in that." "It wasn't love," he said, his voice hardening. "At least not on her part." After finding those notes, I started paying more attention, checking her phone when she was in the shower, listening to her conversations. "She's been planning this from the beginning, Mom." He pulled out his phone and showed me text messages between Amelia and her friend, the same maid of honor I had overheard at the wedding. "Got him to propose. Wedding next month. Mother-in-law still playing poor, but we know the truth. Dollar, dollar, dollar. Coming soon." Another text. "Need to push for house money right after wedding. Strike while emotional connection high." And most damning of all, a message from just before the wedding, Jackson clueless about family wealth. "Once married, legal rights to assets. Lawyer says estate planning can be challenged." Reading these messages, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and heartbreak. My suspicions had been right, but that brought no joy, only sadness for what my son was going through. Jackson took his phone back, his expression resolute despite his obvious pain. I left while she was meeting with some friends this morning. Told her I needed to clear my head. I came straight here because I needed to know if what I suspected was true. I'm so sorry, Jackson, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. No, I'm sorry, he insisted. I should have listened to my instincts, or at least to yours. You were cautious about her from the beginning, weren't you? I nodded. I had concerns, but I wanted to support your happiness, and I could have been wrong. But you weren't, he said flatly. And now I'm married to someone who only wanted me for a potential inheritance. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling around us. What happens now? I finally asked. Jackson straightened his shoulders, a glimpse of determination breaking through his despair. First, I want to know everything about Dad's estate and your financial situation. No more secrets between us. Then we confront Amelia together, with evidence of what she's been doing. I hesitated. Are you sure confronting her is wise? It might be better to speak with a divorce attorney first. Divorce, he repeated the word sounding foreign on his tongue. My marriage didn't even last a week. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. He shook his head. Don't be. Better to find out now than years down the road after children or more entangled finances. His expression hardened again. But I want her to know that we know. I won't let her slither away thinking she almost succeeded. Over the next few hours, I showed Jackson everything: the estate documents, investment portfolios, and the protective measures I had put in place with Linda after noticing Amelia's concerning behavior. I explained the trusts Harold had established for Jackson that would mature when he turned 35, and the letter his father had written explaining his philosophy about wealth and family. Dad was right, Jackson said after reading Harold's letter. Money reveals character. It just took Amelia to show me how true that island. We called Linda and asked her to come over, bringing with her the documentation of yesterday's confrontation. Together, the three of us developed a strategy for confronting Amelia while protecting both Jackson and the family assets. The marriage is so new that an annulment might be possible, Linda advised, especially with evidence of fraud or misrepresentation. If not, a divorce will be relatively straightforward given the short duration and the prenuptial agreement. There is no prenup, Jackson admitted, looking ashamed. Linda and I exchanged glances. That complicates things, she acknowledged, but not insurmountably. The evidence of her intentions is compelling, and most states have laws that protect inheritances as separate property. As evening approached, Jackson called Amelia, his voice steady as he asked her to come to my house to discuss family financial matters. Her eagerness was evident even through the phone. While waiting for her arrival, Jackson sat in his father's study, looking at the photographs on the wall. I wish Dad was here, he said softly. He would have seen through her immediately. He would be proud of how you're handling this now, I told him. That's what matters. When the doorbell rang an hour later, Jackson and I exchanged a look of determination. Whatever happened next, we would face it together with truth and the strength that comes from family bonds that can't be bought or manipulated. The confrontation that followed would be difficult but necessary, marking the end of a painful chapter and the beginning of healing for both of us. The confrontation with Amelia was every bit as difficult as we had anticipated, but necessary for both Jackson's closure and our legal protection. When she arrived at my house that evening, her face lit up at the sight of Jackson, quickly morphing into calculated sympathy when she noticed his distress. Darling, what's wrong? She asked, reaching for him. Your mother isn't giving you a hard time about our financial discussions, is she? Jackson stepped back from her touch. Let's sit down, Amelia. We need to talk. In my living room with Linda present as our attorney, we laid out everything: the texts on Jackson's phone, my account of her visit with Albert Wright, and the evidence of her searching through personal documents. At first, Amelia tried denial her performance, almost convincing in its indignation. These are ridiculous accusations, she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. I love Jackson. Yes, I was curious about family finances, but what wife wouldn't be? A wife who married for love wouldn't bring a financial advisor to demand $10 million 5 days after the wedding, I pointed out calmly. When denial failed, she attempted to drive a wedge between Jackson and me. Your mother has always disliked me, she told him, reaching for his hand. She's trying to control you through money, can't you see that? Jackson withdrew his hand. Stop lying, Amelia. I've seen the text to your friends. I know this marriage was a calculated financial move from the beginning. Her facade cracked, then anger replacing the tears that had dried up suspiciously quickly. Fine, she snapped. What was I supposed to do? Marry some struggling academic with no prospects? Your family is sitting on $53 million while living like middle-class nobodies. It's pathetic. What's pathetic? Jackson replied with remarkable composure. Is thinking money equals happiness or success. My father built his business through hard work and integrity values you clearly don't understand. Linda then outlined the path forward: immediate separation annulment proceedings based on fraud and a cease and desist regarding any claims against my estate. Amelia's expression grew increasingly furious as she realized her schemes were collapsing. You'll regret this, she hissed as she gathered her designer purse. Both of you. I have rights as a spouse, and I'll make sure this costs you dearly. The only thing that costs dearly here is the lesson I've learned, Jackson replied. And it was worth every penny. After she stormed out, Jackson sat heavily on the couch, emotional exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I can't believe I was so blind. Love makes us vulnerable, I said, sitting beside him. There's no shame in having an open heart. The weeks that followed were challenging, but healing. With Linda's expert guidance, Jackson filed for an annulment on grounds of fraud and misrepresentation. Amelia initially threatened a lengthy legal battle, but backed down when presented with the overwhelming evidence of her calculated deception. The marriage was annulled 6 weeks later, declared legally void, as if it had never happened. The financial aftermath was relatively straightforward thanks to the brevity of the marriage and our quick actions. Jackson took responsibility for the wedding debt, insisting on paying it himself despite my offer to help. I need to clean up my own mess, he said firmly. Dad would have expected nothing less. Throughout this difficult period, I watched my son grieve, not just the relationship, but the future he had imagined. Yet within that grief, I also saw him reconnecting with the values Harold and I had raised him, with integrity, responsibility, and the understanding that true wealth lies in character, not bank accounts. 3 months after the annulment, Jackson and I established a new tradition of weekly financial discussions, where we openly reviewed investments, plans, and philanthropic opportunities. It was during one of these meetings that I formally established a trust for Jackson, with specific conditions that reflected both protection and trust. The money will be available to you at 35 as your father planned, I explained, but with provisions that protect it from future claims. Not because I don't trust your judgment, but because everyone deserves a second layer of security. Jackson nodded, understanding the wisdom in this approach. I've been thinking about what to do with it eventually, he said. Maybe a scholarship fund for first-generation college students in Dad's name. His words filled me with pride. This was Harold's son through and through. As summer turned to fall, I began to see glimpses of the old Jackson returning. His academic work had actually flourished in the aftermath of the Amelia disaster, with a book contract and promotion to associate professor. He had also started volunteering at a financial literacy program for young adults, turning his painful experience into education that might help others avoid similar pitfalls. Mom, he said one Sunday evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, I want to thank you for protecting Dad's legacy the way you did. If you had told me about the full inheritance earlier, Amelia might have succeeded. I finished for him. Or someone else would have tried eventually. He nodded. I understand now why you and Dad kept so much private. Money doesn't just change how others see you, it can change how you see yourself if you're not careful. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I watched with quiet joy as Jackson began dating again, this time with a children's librarian named Kate, who drove a 15-year-old car and packed homemade lunches. Their relationship progressed slowly, built on shared interests and values, rather than whirlwind romance. When he brought her to dinner, she spent more time asking about Harold's life stories than his business success. She doesn't know about the inheritance, Jackson told me after that dinner, and I'm not going to tell her until I'm absolutely certain she loves me for me. My journey through this experience taught me lessons I never expected to learn in my 60s. I discovered that protecting family wealth isn't just about legal documents and financial structures, but about nurturing the values that created that wealth in the first place. I learned that secrets can sometimes be necessary boundaries rather than harmful barriers. Most importantly, I realized that Harold's financial wisdom had been a form of love and protection that continued even after he was gone. The $53 million that Amelia coveted remains largely intact, growing steadily under Thomas's management. But its true value isn't in the numbered accounts or investment portfolios. Its value lies in the education fund we established for low-income students, in the small business loans we provide to entrepreneurs with dreams like Harold's, and in the security it represents for future generations of our family, who will hopefully understand that money is a tool, not an identity. In the end, the fortune Harold left behind did exactly what he intended. It provided security without replacing the need for character, work ethic, and personal responsibility. By staying silent about that inheritance when my son got married, I protected not just the money but the values it represented. Have you ever had to keep a secret to protect someone you love? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more life lessons from someone who's learned them the hard way. Remember to share this video with anyone who might be navigating complex family financial situations. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the wisdom to protect what matters most in your own life.